The Stafford Act is the primary statutory framework through which the federal government provides aid to states and localities when natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, or floods overwhelm local capacity to respond. The Stafford Act authorizes two types of declarations that allow the President and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to coordinate relief efforts and funnel resources to affected areas: major disaster declarations and emergency declarations. President Trump's use of his Stafford Act authorities during the COVID-19 pandemic has been unprecedented in several respects. It marks the first use of a major disaster declaration for a pandemic, the first time all 50 states have disaster declarations simultaneously, and the first time a president has issued a nationwide emergency declaration without state request. The Stafford Act authorizes the president to declare a major disaster upon request by a state governor or tribal leader when any natural catastrophe causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant federal assistance to supplement state and local efforts. The statute specifies that natural catastrophe includes any hurricane, tornado, storm, high water, wind-driven water, tidal wave, tsunami, earthquake, volcanic eruption, landslide, mudslide, snowstorm, or drought. A major disaster declaration can also be based on any fire, flood, or explosion, regardless of cause. Absent from this list is any mention of a pandemic or other public health emergency. Because of that omission, some, including at times FEMA, have argued that a pandemic does not qualify as a natural catastrophe that can trigger a major disaster declaration because it doesn't damage physical infrastructure, such as buildings or roads, in the way that a hurricane or earthquake does. President Trump's COVID-19 disaster declarations clearly take a broader view of federal power. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic marks the first time that every state in the nation has requested and received a major disaster declaration at the same time for the same disaster. On March 20th, President Trump issued a major disaster declaration for New York, followed by California and Washington on March 22nd. Disaster declarations were issued for other states and U.S. territories over the next several weeks. On April 11th, Wyoming was the 50th state to receive a COVID-19 disaster declaration. The president has also used his authority to declare Stafford Act emergencies in an unprecedented way. On March 13, 2020, President Trump unilaterally declared a nationwide Stafford Act emergency for COVID-19 without waiting for requests from individual states. Because Stafford Act aid is intended to help when local resources are insufficient, the president can only issue a Stafford Act major disaster declaration at the request of the affected state, tribe, or territory. Like major disaster declarations, most emergency declarations are triggered by a request from the governor of an affected state. The president does, however, have power under Section 501B of the Stafford Act to unilaterally declare an emergency without a state request when the president determines that the federal government has primary responsibility for the emergency because the subject area is one for which the federal government exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority under the Constitution or federal statutes. This power to unilaterally declare a uniquely federal emergency has previously been exercised when federal property has been attacked or destroyed. President Clinton was the first to invoke this section to declare a Stafford Act emergency after the 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and President George W. Bush likewise invoked this authority after the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon. It has never before been used on a national scale or for an incident over which states have so much response authority. In declaring the COVID-19 emergency, President Trump asserted that only the federal government can provide the necessary coordination to address a pandemic of this national size and scope, and that it is the preeminent responsibility of the federal government to take action to stem a nationwide pandemic that has its origins abroad. This assertion contrasts with the president's later insistence that states have primary responsibility for pandemic response, including securing testing supplies and personal protective equipment, even when the absence of federal coordination results in bidding wars between states. President Trump's relatively unusual use of Stafford Act authority highlights both how unusual this disaster is and how pandemics don't fit neatly into our current disaster response framework.